Karl and his wife Katie started Northern Natural Gardens in 2018 with the goal of changing the way people view their yards while trying to bring as much nature into our urban residential spaces as possible. They've been gardening with native plants for 4 years, and Karl is excited to share what they have learned throughout the time and hope to inspire others. Karl, that's you.
Well, thank you, Jessica, and thank you to Wild Ones Twin Cities. I'm really honored to be here talking with you all on this lovely winter day. Just kidding, but it's pretty crazy weather out there. I'd like to talk with you about the natural gardening method. It's something that we've learned from and developed along the way as we've started our own gardens and many other gardens around the Twin Cities metro area. I'm going to be talking about a lot of stuff, so please ask questions. If I can't get to the questions at the end of the presentation, please feel free to reach out to me directly on social media at Northern Natural Gardens, or you can email me directly, Karl at Northern Natural Gardens, which you'll see down there, and I'll show at the end of the presentation too. We're an open book. We love to share, so please let us know your thoughts. The natural gardening method is something that we like to call what we do is creating gardens with a minimal ecological footprint, with a low financial commitment, and a maximum environmental benefit, which is obviously the most important. I will be talking about myself, us, and Northern Natural Gardens a little bit. The benefits to this style of gardening, talk a little bit about our installation process, about our management process through the future, and looking into the future and where we hope to see the gardens of the future. I'm Karl, my wife is Katie. We started Northern Natural Gardens, well, I guess technically a couple years ago, but we've been doing it for about the last 4 years now. We met in art school where we were studying photography, and we almost immediately started a wedding photography business together, which we operated for around 7 years. When we bought our house in 2016, we pretty much had our garden plans ready to roll right away, and we got going on that almost immediately. We had our gardens dug and seeded by March of 2017. I don't know if you remember that winter, we had like a week of 60-degree weather in the middle of February. So we did a lot of work in the middle of February, which was awesome. We had our gardens planted early enough for a pretty good winter stratification. By the end of that first year, which we now looking back on, consider pretty successful first year, we had friends and family interested. So we did a few gardens, most of them full yard projects for some friends and some family, which was kind of the unofficial start to the business. It was a thought at that point. By 2018, we had created Northern Natural Gardens and started working on that as a business, and we were able to transition full-time in 2019, wrapping up the last of our weddings, which also in hindsight was an interesting move considering what the pandemic has done to the wedding industry. At this point now, we've created over 30 natural gardens, most of them full yard projects, and we've helped countless DIY homeowners how to create their own natural gardens, their own native gardens to benefit wildlife. Here is our house on inspection day. This is a backyard from the alley looking towards our house. You can see here a lot of lawn, mainly Creeping Charlie lawn, with a nice little landscape circle of reed canary grass. Hiding in there is an amazing old stump, which I'm thinking is an ash tree, which we'll talk about a little bit later. We have a hedge of spirea and currants along the house. A pretty classic looking yard, and we knew right away that we wanted something different. Here is that February of 2017. Just more snow on the ground now for sure. So warm, wet soil, ready to go. Some of the lines are marked out. Here is after our first initial seeding. This is the very first project that we ever did. You can see that the mulch used in this garden was recycled pine straw or pine needles from our neighbor's white pines, which we found worked really well and has become a staple of our process ever since. You'll also see that nice big stump there, which has now decomposed even further and created about a 4-foot hole in the garden in that space, which is just full of networks of different mammals, chipmunks and voles. We see birds bouncing in and out of there. We see bumblebees, bumblebee queens flying in and out of there earlier in the spring. It's a really cool place. This is August of our very first year. So you can see, looking back, after doing many of these projects now, we had a pretty good first year. The first year tends to be pretty slow, which I'm sure a lot of you have learned, especially when planting from seed. We have the typical black-eyed Susans, some partridge pea, some of those quicker to establish cool season grasses. I remember we had a lot of Canada wild rye that first year. Here is summer of the second year. So we still have a lot of those pioneer plants, those quick to establish annuals, biennials. We're also starting to get some more of the longer lived perennials to really show off, specifically a sawtooth sunflower, which has done really well in our yard. This was the late summer, early fall of our second year. You can see those sawtooth sunflowers really going, well, white snakeroot, which is something that we really take advantage of in our gardens. And still some of the black-eyed Susans, Canada goldenrod there towards the left, which is starting to fill in, which we've taken some measures to control in the future. But at this point, in the end of our second year, we were feeling really good about what we were doing, and we really were starting to feel like we had created a pretty magical place. This was last year, earlier in the summer. The sunflower haven't really taken off yet. I don't know if you've noticed that we're slowly making little changes to the house and yard, new fence and new siding, all part of the process. And this was taken just a couple months ago. Again, in August, things are really filling out. Our perennials are really clumping out and kind of claiming their territory. Some of the volunteer trees that we've allowed to grow are actually now and not like weeds. This was a good year, and it has been better every year, and we cannot wait to see what next year looks like. And before and after on the left, and a view of the front of our house on the right. So why did we do this? Doug Tallamy is a hero of ours. So you will probably see some repeated information if you're familiar with him, which I'm sure a lot of you are. But we're worried about the environment, like many people are. Population declines, 30% of North American birds, habitat loss with urban expansion, pesticides and neonicotinoids especially, and the fact that we have 45 million acres of lawn, probably more since that number was created. That just shows us there's a huge potential for conversion. We're also aware of changing home buyer demographics. People are younger. People also have what we hear all the time from our potential clients and our peers is not so much a want to be in the yard working all the time. There's less desire for old social standards when it comes to the yard. People are busy, often two people working in a household, and our generation, I'll speak for myself and for my peers, we don't know that much. A lack of experience in general. I was lucky to garden with my parents, but I think that from a traditional point of view, we're seeing less of those gardening skills passed on, which gives us a great opportunity to change the scene. We like to look at nature as a garden. Natural areas need us. It's a new revelation for me, thinking about what it means to have pristine wilderness. But the fact is, our large grazing mammals and wildfires are gone, and we need to think about ways to intervene, or we will end up with acres and acres of buckthorn or reed canary grass or cattails, etc. It are those careful disturbances that help to contribute to diversity in a garden and in any natural area. It goes for woods, prairies, shorelines, all of them. We need to be thinking about um, material removal and regeneration as we're working in them. Or, as I like to say, we need to garden it. What is different about this? Well, of course, there are a lot of things that are similar. I would definitely have the same. We have very common goals in what we're doing with wildlife, but we often see plugs or small plants. The more traditional method of gardening, where there's mulch in between those plants. Having plants in certain areas as adults means that watering is likely to keep these plants healthy. When it comes to establishing those gardens, we see herbicide use and smothering, which are effective tools in the right situation, but we don't use them. And we often see power tools. We are trying to look at things a little differently. We plant mainly from seed. We will plant small trees, shrubs, and some of the harder to establish perennials in our gardens. But we're really trying to think about the main core of the garden to be seed planted. This will give us a matrix of plants. Our typical garden will use anywhere from 3 to 4 different pre-mixed seed mixes, which we'll talk about our seed sources. We'll use them in conjunction with each other. We'll often end up with over 100 different species down in an urban lot in different areas in the garden. This will create a matrix of plants that will sustain itself. And we also kind of are constantly thinking with a tough love mentality. So if a plant can't survive there without water, it doesn't belong there. So we do not water, even if that means some things don't make it. With seeding and seeding in a matrix, something will take its place. We like to use recycled materials when we can, and we like to recycle materials while we're working. So whether that's brush or other organic material, especially sod, since a lot of our projects are ripping up sod and creating new areas, we like to incorporate those into the project so that we can keep our haul out to a minimum and our ecological footprint to a minimum. We don't use herbicide, although herbicide can be, I think we're not anti-herbicide by any means. We just find that with this method and with the management schedule, which we'll talk about later, but is monthly throughout the growing season, so typically 6 visits a season, we figured out ways to work around herbicide that's just as effective. We also like to use hand tools. We use hand tools whenever possible. When we're working in a natural area, I've seen what happens when you even just make a little noise with the motor and the goldfinches take off. And I like to dig a new garden with the goldfinches hanging out nearby. There are definitely benefits. Buying seed is relatively cheap. Especially when you think about per plant. You can get a lot of plants growing for a relatively cheap amount of, relatively low cost when you think about buying individual plants. Yeah, quicker to get started when you consider that we are not we're not smothering or doing a kill off first. We kind of work with, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but we kind of work with those weeds and take advantage of them to help us. Editing plants means you have plenty of cut flowers. You can think about this when planting from seed as almost a reverse gardening. So as opposed to starting with a blank slate and adding plants where you want to plant them, we're starting with everything and whittling down to what we want to see growing in the area. Think about it like you're painting a picture, but you have all of the colors on the canvas and you're scraping off those colors to get things going. A lot of cut flowers, also a lot of organic material, which something that we're not going to talk about this in this presentation, but is also the beginnings of our vegetable garden operation. When you're recycling material within a project, using less resources, you're creating less waste, which of course is better for the environment. Our goals, our main goals when we are looking at a new garden and we're thinking about all of our gardens as a whole, we want to create a new landscape with a minimal ecological footprint that can be duplicated easily on a typical urban lot. We want to keep those costs low for homeowners. We want them to be relatively low maintenance. Now, of course, there's going to be management, but if you were to think about gardens of this size, planted in a more conventional way, it's considerably less maintenance per plant. And of course, we want to see these gardens create the maximum of environmental benefits. So our process is really two parts, two pretty equal parts, installation and management. And we want to think about every project in those two respects. Installation is important and it's the beginning of the process, but by no means is it going to create a successful garden with just a one and done approach. Management is very important to really take these gardens off. Into the future, we make sure that every project that we do includes 2 years of management to get things going, and being very open and honest with them to let them know that in order to keep things healthy, there'll need to be some sort of management, whether that's us helping educate or having us come back and keep working on those projects. So we'll talk about installation first. What you'll need, this is what we use. These are our main tools that we use we keep around our truck. A shovel or sod kicker, something to lift sod off the ground, which, like I said before, is a big part of the process in most of our projects. A good hard rake, native seed, of course. We'll talk about where we get our seed and what we look for in our seed. Trees and shrubs, and the occasional perennial plant, potted plant. Watering can, for getting those in the ground. And bags or some way. We often use the recycled paper bags to haul out organic material that we can't recycle. And when there is not viable seed, we'll bring that to our municipal compost. First things first, you got to get a plan down. On the left there, you'll see what we will typically hand over to a full yard design project. We like to call it a concept design. We really, things that are missing from our designs compared to many garden designs is the differentiation of different plants. You'll notice that we are really just using shapes to show people what their gardens are going to look like. I think it's the best way for us to explain that this is nature. We're not sure exactly what's going to pop up yet, but this is kind of what we're going for a feeling, for an atmosphere. On the bottom left there, you'll see how we have our yards divided between natural garden areas and lawn. We do think lawn is an important part of a landscape in order to be able to move around and use that space and get out in there and enjoy it. But for the most part, we're generally removing 50 to 60% of the lawn in a yard and replacing with wild space. We like to consider how the space is used. Like I said, the lawn should be functional. If you're only ever standing in a certain area of lawn behind your lawnmower, then we really like to think about how we can turn that into a natural area. If it's a walkway, if it's an area for lawn games or setting up a lawn chair or an access point for getting to an electric meter, or if it's along a neighbor's property that we need to leave some space for. And often, and a lot of times people are surprised by this, the boulevard I find is actually a really great spot for lawn, for people getting in and out of their vehicles, for moving around. I often see this as one of the first places that gets converted into a natural space. And it works really well in a lot of situations. For us, we have a fire hydrant, we have essentially one parking spot in front of our house. So we keep that lawn and really try to fill up the rest of our yard with natural garden. Privacy becomes a huge element in almost every project that we do. Even people who get along really well with their neighbors are still always wondering if maybe just a little bit of privacy from a kitchen window or something like that. There's nothing wrong with that. And that's really where we are generally putting those trees and shrubs, especially some evergreens, and building berms in those areas so that we can kind of accelerate that. Stormwater flow is really important. Drainage, of course, is always important when you're designing any new landscape. Those low areas or rain gardens, which can have different definitions. For us, it's anywhere that's going to collect that rain and absorb the rainwater. A lot of times those depressions will be useful. That soil dig out will help us build up different areas of the gardens. Also think about specific habitat areas. So whether that's a brush pile or a rotten stump like we have in our yard, or some shrubs, really try to think about that. Timing. Do you want to do this in the spring or in the fall? Both of those are good seasons with slightly different results, especially in the first couple years. And there are a couple different reasons why you might want to do one or the other. If you are like many people here in Minnesota, are putting together your garden design or new garden designs over the winter, you're going to want to get going right away. And spring can be a really good time to do that. The benefits are that you are able to get started earlier, get that seed in the ground, start seeing natives pop up right away in that first summer. Generally, it's slower in a spring install for the first year, but you will typically see better warm season grass establishment. And if you can be patient for that first year, a lot of times we see some really darn good diversity in the second year gardens when we do a spring planting. Fall benefits allow you to really spend more time in the summer working on removing weeds and removing sod, and also getting that seed in the ground in the fall allows you to have a full winter of cold stratification. So you'll probably see more flowers and more diversity of flowers in the first year if you do a fall planting. Now, that being said, over time, they should catch up. So it really comes out of that first year. Excavation. I'm using a sod kicker on that left photo there. That is about the hardest, nastiest clay, suburban clay sod that I've ever worked in. It was incredible, but we got it up. It was a really big garden. First off, we marked the lines. We always like to do that with our clients and like to brainstorm about that. If you have the time to mark out lines and live with it for a couple days, walk around the space, always suggest that because things will change. Weed removal, especially if we're working up against an existing natural area. Otherwise, if we're working in a fresh sod area, sod removal becomes the big thing. Creating berms and swales by recycling that material. So we just flip that sod over and then cover, and then we basically create the skeleton of our berm with the sod, and then we'll cover with 3 to 4 inches of soil so that it will smother out that sod. And we get that soil from low areas that we're creating to collect water and redirect water. We also exclusively use a natural edge, which is just the turf leading up to the garden space and then dropping down into the garden space. It can be a little tender at first, but once that sod establishes and once the natives establish in the garden, it creates a really nice, natural looking boundary between the gardens that's becomes really easy to take care of. Again, we're with those gardens, we're with all of our gardens for the first 2 years. So while those gardens are establishing, we do that lawn and edge maintenance. And by the time we hand the gardens over, there's really nothing to do. Planting trees and shrubs, which I'm sure all of you have plenty of experience with, so I'll go through this pretty quickly. We are thinking about the right species for the right space, of course. A little easier to let Mother Nature do that for us with seed, but when we're planting those native trees and shrubs and other perennials, we have to wrap our heads around how we think it might do in that space. We also like to think about nursery availability. Now we get a lot of our plants from Outback Nursery in Hastings, Tom. It's a really great place. But since there aren't too many native plant nurseries out there and availability can fluctuate from year to year, I really like to go, and as the project is getting close, take a look and see what's looking good if I don't have something very specific in mind. You also notice in this photo too here, in the right photo, that we've got some iris and some peonies growing in there. I do like to every once in a while leave a lilac or a peony or some sort of classic garden plant in a garden. A lot of times they'll have a certain value for the homeowner, maybe something that they transplanted from their mom's garden, or something that reminds them of their childhood. And even though it's not native, you know, these are natural gardens, specifically native gardens, and if they bring some sort of joy, we'll incorporate them when we can. Consider wildlife value. Ecosystem services is what Doug Tallamy calls, basically defines that the value of wildlife that a certain plant has a potential to bring in. Here in Minnesota, oaks and cherries are going to be very important plants for moth and butterfly caterpillars and thus birds. So we always try to get an oak, or if we're looking for a tree, or a choke cherry shrub, if we're looking for some privacy, we try to get one or two of those in every project, even if it's more of a prairie style garden, just because of the extra diversity that can bring in. Allow native volunteer plants. You never know. We had a buckthorn hedge, I forgot to mention it in the earlier photos, a very old buckthorn hedge along our alley when we inherited our house. We lived with it for a whole year, and then when it came time to cutting that buckthorn hedge down, there were, because it was really important privacy, the buckthorn hedge, but when we finally cut it down, we made a huge sacrifice for privacy, but we noticed dozens of little knee-high ash trees. Well, within a year, they were all 8-foot tall hedge plants, and we've removed many of them and keeping them thinned out and just kind of perpetuating that hedge. But it was a really quick and easy way for us to get our privacy back, using natives for essentially for free, since they were growing there. And now next year we have some really healthy cherries, oaks, wild plum in that space that should eventually take over for those faster growing, let's call them weedier green ash trees that we have coming in there. So when you're creating a natural garden, be open to letting nature help garden a little bit. A squirrel planting an acorn, a walnut, whatever. Seeding. This is obviously the biggest part of our installation here, although it takes the shortest amount of time once we finally get the gardens prepped. Choosing your seed. Of course, we want to think about the seed mix for the conditions. Wet, dry, or medium soils, where it's going to be sunny or shady. And native plant nurseries do a really good job of pointing you in the right direction. I also like to mention, be liberal with those seeds. And if you have a mix, if you're working in a sunny area and a shady area, don't feel like you need to put a solid line on where those seed mixes start and stop. I'm often surprised by some certain plant species that should be growing in hot, dry conditions that just happen to really find a great spot to grow along the wood's edge. And it's a fun little surprise that you would miss out on if you weren't experimenting a little bit. Minnesota native landscapes, shooting star, prairie restorations, and of course prairie moon are probably the main areas where we get our seed, and they're all great resources. Prairie moon, of course, is an exceptional resource just to learn. I love spending time on that website. And add your own seeds. Collect your milkweed seed pods, grab seeds from your asters and Joe Pye, and just have fun with it. Soil prep is pretty simple. Once you get that layer of sod off, we like to keep compacted soil, which is contrary to some of that vegetable garden mentality or traditional gardening mentality, and just lightly raking the top of the soil. That good compacted soil is going to retain moisture. It's going to be easier for those seeds to germinate that first year. And then seed. Seed away. We have our own techniques, usually involves some sort of funky dance where I'm waving my arms around with little pieces of seed flying around everywhere. It's pretty glamorous. Cover crop is also something that we're spending a lot more time experimenting with. We usually use oats, especially for late summer, early fall installations. I think there is a lot more to learn about the different varieties of cover crop and how they can be beneficial in an urban natural garden. This is a garden that we did last fall, showing you the moment of seeding. We've got our lightly raked but compacted soil. You can see the natural edge on that garden, pretty defined in this photo. And you can see on the right that we have our some pine straw bales. So pine straw or pine needles, something that we kind of stumbled upon as a mulch erosion control option. If you remember from the beginning of the slideshow, I talked about those recycled white pine needles that we use in our gardens, something that we just always held on to. We're shocked by how well, and continue to be shocked by how well they do on slopes to retain the soil and keep seed in place. It's really amazing. So we now get our pine straw from a source in the southern United States, from a sustainable pine tree farm. It's really nice long needles. The way they pack it really kind of crinkles them together. They lock together really well. It's pretty cheap. It covers a huge distance, and of course it breaks down naturally over time. Straw blanket, brush bundles for erosion are also important. You can see on the left here, we've combined a few of the methods. This is a very large slope in Bloomington, and we have pine straw or the pine needles over a lot of the garden. And we also have buckthorn bundles that you can see kind of laid out across the slope, perpendicular to the slope, that we had removed from this project. So it all stayed on site. There was a lot of buckthorn on this project that we used to help with wooden stakes to help keep the soil in place. And then you can also see some straw blanket, which is that manufactured straw blanket that you often see on the side of the highways or freeways or in other prairie restoration projects that we've used in some of the worst areas. When you're putting that pine straw down, it's important to spread it lightly. Keep it really loose. If you think about looking down at a straw blanket where you can see the straw blanket, but you can also see the soil underneath it, that's essentially the consistency that we're looking for those needles, so that it's thick enough to hold back the soil, but also thin enough to allow those delicate native seedlings to germinate and grow through. We don't want to smother them. After we have it spreaded, we water things lightly, and then we walk a lot, like a lot on that new project, just to make sure we have good seed to soil contact. For the erosion control blanket, we like to use steel staples just because of their effectiveness. There are biodegradable wooden stakes and some different options out there, which we feel are a little trickier to work with. The steel will eventually rust out and disintegrate in the soil too. And of course, like I showed you in this photo, sometimes we have to combine those methods. Monthly management is something that is a very important part of the process. It all starts when we get the seed down, but those visits, especially during the first year, are really probably the most important times that we're spending with the gardens. You'll almost for sure see a ton of weeds, non-native weeds, pop up in the first year. If you're anywhere in the metro area, we've had some really good luck out in the outer rings of the suburbs where it's almost entirely natives coming up in that first year, which is wonderful. But the seed bank, the amount of weed seeds that have built up in the cities and in our urban areas, in our residential areas is incredible and is overwhelming, but is a part of the process. Learning what those plants are is crucial, and learning the difference between them is just as important. We like to start by really, if we were to suggest to people who are taking this on in their own hands, learn the non-natives first. There'll be less of them. They might stand out a little easier to you. They'll probably be the first things that you see, and you don't have to be overwhelmed by learning 100 different native plant species. That will come with time. With those non-native invasive plants, learning the difference between annual and biennial plants and whether they're invasive long-term or perennial, or if they're going to be just a phase, a successional phase where they'll likely be gone next year, even if you did nothing to them. For the native plant ID, if you're in doubt, just leave it alone and you can discover that later. One thing that we really stress is pulling those weeds versus cutting them. And we find that many times, almost all the time, we're cutting those weeds when we see them first. If it's an annual weed, even if it's a biennial weed, we're rather than pulling that weed, we'll just cut it and sometimes have to cut it repeatedly. But since we're on that monthly schedule, we can allow for that. Pulling a weed can often just create more soil disturbance and will often just encourage another round of those same weeds to grow if there's enough of that seed built up in the soil. It's when we were first starting, and I would pull a tiny little piece of creeping Charlie and rip a rattlesnake master out of the ground. That's a pretty defeating feeling. And when you can address that either at a later time or at a time when that rattlesnake master is actually established in the soil before you start working on that, it can definitely pay to be patient. Patient and persistent. It's persistence and timing is definitely the key. Learning the habits of a specific plant when you're not using chemicals. Again, we were talking about the seed bank for the weeds, and the same way that the weeds, in using weeds, I'm generally talking about plants that we don't want growing there. A lot of times those are non-native plants. Most of the time they're non-native plants, and sometimes they're invasive. But we also need to build up that seed bank with our natives. So we will, at a minimum, reseed, sometimes adding new species, sometimes concentrating on a specific species. We'll do that seasonally, and oftentimes in fall. We just got done doing most of our projects last week ahead of the snow. So we feel pretty good about the timing, although snow or seed can be spread in the snow as well. Here is a progress series of photos here from a 2-year-old garden. This was on installation day of May 23rd of last year, which is generally pretty late in the season for us. We have a cutoff of June 1st where we don't do any seeding anymore. This is July, 2 months later of the same year. And you can see in the photo, towards the bottom of the photo, some black-eyed Susan, but a majority of what you're seeing is foxtail and crabgrass. But that's okay. This is later that summer. We had done some work on the crabgrass and foxtail, basically just getting down low and cutting off the seed heads, but with the main goal of not so much as removing every last seed as we were trying to allow sunlight to get down into the soil and start to get those native plants established for the following year. This was about a year after, this year, about a year after the photo prior. So we have a huge flush of those pioneering black-eyed Susans. We also have American bellflower, figwort, all sorts of mints, monarda, really, really great diversity in this garden this year. It was a lot of fun to see the transformation, like it always is. We even have some zigzag goldenrod flowering this year, which for us, I think is a first to have that blooming in the second year. It's really fun. Along with the monthly management, there's seasonal management, which is relatively minimal. Sure, a lot of you have your own techniques for keeping your gardens maintained seasonally with wildlife in mind, which is great. We like to leave the leaves. We do only leave them in the gardens. We're also careful not to rake leaves from our yard into our gardens, at least in a way that's not going to create a mat of leaves that could smother the plants. There's also a chance of raking in those yard weed seeds into the garden, and we don't want that either. So if you have a yard that's 60-70% natural garden, wouldn't feel too bad about raking up those leaves. I think doing it often before there's opportunities for a lot of those insects, overwintering moths, to ladybug or lightning bugs to really get in there, then that's a good thing, especially if you can keep your lawn green and healthy so that you don't have to resort to some sort of chemical treatment to fix it in the future. Of course, leave the seed heads, leave the stems. We have birds in our yard all winter long eating seeds, and it is such a delight to have that in the middle of February, to have nature and activity in the yard. Same with the stems and the snow and the matting and the plant material. We'll bring in mammals. We'll see the possums come through and the raccoons in the winter, and it's what I live for. I love it. This is a video from last year. Just some goldfinches enjoying echinacea seeds. This year has been standout. Our fourth growing season in our garden. We have had so many birds, and I'll have to get some video of all the birds that we've been having. Something that we've just started trying is test plots. So this is us looking towards the future here. We think that the easier we can make this, the more impact that we can have, the more lawn conversions that we'll end up seeing. We're always looking to figure out ways to make things cheaper, physically easier, and a quicker and more efficient excavation and garden prep. We have started small this year. We hope to expand our test plots as we learn more. We've got 3 separate approaches here, one of which is our control, the way we've always done it, with complete sod excavation with pine straw down on top of the seed. And then we've also tried a couple much less labor intensive methods. One being burning, which you see on the right, which we did with a propane torch. We spent about 10 minutes burning the sod down after a rake in that garden. And then in the middle there, we have just a rake or just a dethatch where we've put seed down over raked grasses. We don't know a lot yet. I do know that the cover crop, the oats that we've put down in the burned area, is coming through the best so far in the process, which we don't have photos of, unfortunately. But over the next year or two, we'll really be able to learn a lot. As we go into management, we'll be dividing each of these gardens up into different sections, where we will then be doing different techniques for mowing or lack of mowing or potential burning. We have a lot of ideas in mind. So we're just gonna kind of throw a bunch of different stuff at this and see what happens. Well, what does the future look like for our urban environment, for the nature that we're all part of? Natural gardening is easy. There's no expertise needed, just curiosity. Plants are not just decorations. We need them to survive, and we're all learning this. Your yard is nature first, and I think that is a huge revelation that we're as a society we're starting to realize. What is the health of that nature in your yard? What is the value of that? We're trying to imagine a new normal landscape, one that has the potential for continued urban expansion, which unfortunately there's no end in sight. What does that look like? We have an opportunity to change the status quo, and now is the time. I will end this with a quote from my man Doug. We can save nature, but only if we learn to live with it. I will start taking some questions now. And like I said earlier, if you want to follow us or send a message, we're at Northern Natural Gardens, and my email is Karl at Northern Natural Gardens, and I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Karl, that was just lovely.
Thanks, Jessica.
I just love the succinctness. I love how nice and easy it was to follow through with your story. You answered, I think, a couple questions. Just coming forward. One of the first questions that came out was snake root, weed. Can you tell me? I want it, I don't?
That is a good question. There are certain plants like snakeroot, Canada goldenrod, and others that people have an interesting relationship with. White snakeroot can definitely be a weed. It is also a very quick to establish, aggressive, beautiful white native wildflower. So we let it grow. We let it grow in defined areas that we like to imagine it will look good when it's blooming in August and September. So there is some removal of it as it spreads around. We do find that after the first couple years, after the first year especially, we see less and less of it as those more longer lived, tougher perennials really fill in those spaces. And as we remove more and more through the years. So yes, we like white snakeroot, but in moderation, the same way we like Canada goldenrod, but in moderation. Diversity is key, so that's something that we're always thinking of. One thing I really love about white snakeroot is that it is quick color, quick blooming right away in that first year garden when your spirits might be low, looking at a bunch of low green plants.
That's fantastic. That's really helpful. I've recently been yanking the Canada goldenrod, and so I know what that means. Do you have the program what you use to draw those designs for the yardscape?
Yeah, so I use my hardware is an iPad Pro with a stylus, and the software that I use is called Procreate.
Nice, go Gardens.
Yeah.
Would you quickly tell what cold stratification is?
Yes. I'm not a scientist, so I hope I don't butcher this too much. I'll give you the very basic answer. It's cold stratification is I mostly refer to it or is referring to cold moist stratification, where a seed is in cold and moist conditions, essentially outside in the winter. And for a certain period of time, certain plants might just need a month of that cold stratification. Certain plants might need 90 days of that to help them unlock those germination mechanisms that evolution has told them it's time to start growing. It's summer in Minnesota, and you're not going to freeze to death.
I love it because I know there's some insects that definitely need our winters too. So it's always fun for me to connect that seeds need it to get cold, insects need it to get cold. Do you find the Kentucky bluegrass sneaks into your gardens, at everybody's peril?
Yeah, we see a little bit of that. And what we try to do is really just outcompete it with those aggressive plants, those aggressive prairie plants. They're, you know, with this, we're never gonna really have a 100% native garden. There's always something coming in from somewhere, or it's always been there. So, like for us in particular in our yard, it's Creeping Charlie. We spent a lot of time working on it, but it's still there. So we just kind of have to come to terms with the fact that, well, if it is existing in this garden, but the benefits of all the native plants are much more powerful than if it means, wiping out a whole area for a couple of years in order to get it under control. That's where the trade-off is. And when, as a gardening company working in residential spaces, a lot of times we don't really have that freedom of, smothering for 2 seasons, for example. So we competition is really our approach for stuff like that.
That's really neat. And I love hearing you talk about successional like that. Remember, restored prairies or sometimes native plants, it's a moving target because that's how nature continues to move those. So I love that. Do you ever have a percentage of forbs versus grasses that you'd normally specify?
Well, we are always seeding at recommended rates. So I don't think there's really any sort of specific strategy there, but we always see very different ratios in our gardens. A lot of times just within the same garden, within the same lot, and a lot of times from one garden, one property to another. I'm sure there's a lot of work there, a lot at work there that I don't understand, but I think a lot of times just come down to the timing of the seeding, soil quality, and even the weather that year as seeds are establishing. I like to see a lot of grasses in our gardens. I don't think any of our gardens are really old enough yet to be just like that 90% big blue stem that you see sometimes in those restored prairies. But when it gets to that point, we'll be proactive and make sure that we are creating opportunities for forbs or other grasses to go. I think as long as you're keeping diversity in mind as at kind of the forefront, I think that's the guiding course.
My helpful push for grasses was skipper butterflies. It's like, what? There's another insect that can be my diversity aim and goal.
Yeah.
Um,
I know we've been seeing the last couple years. I'm pretty sure common checker spot checker skippers. I know that they're not in parallel the same way that some of the more southwestern species, or one in particular, anyways, are. Do you know if they also use grasses in the same way, or do all skippers do that?
I suspect so. I bet there's nuance in the insects, just like in plants. Most of them will behave like this, except when they don't. But I think skippers are really greatly connected to grasses. I hope to continue to explore that information.
Yeah, yeah.
Another thing that's the question is compacted soil retaining moisture. Can you detail that? And my suspicion is that we're all kind of thinking, wait a minute, compacted soils, don't we have to dig it all up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, you take a ball of clay, roll it into a ball, and take a ball of loose soil and put it out in the sun, and you'll have powder and lawn, and you're gonna keep some of that moisture in the center of that compacted ball. Um, it's really went against my conventions too. It's information that I picked up on, I believe, Prairie Moon's planting instructions when we first started. Something that we've run with, and we've really seen we've really seen that in real life. We've seen that in action. I should probably clarify compacted soil. I'm not talking like rock hard compacted soil, but when you're working that soil, standing, making sure that you're compressing it with your feet. We call it marching. um, we march all over the gardens just to make sure, especially when we're loosening up soil, just to make sure that it at least has like a human weight compaction on that. It's going to retain moisture because there's not air flowing through that soil, as much air anyways. And also, it's going to hold better in case of a major rainfall event too. It's just not going to wash away on you.
Nice. Propane torch. Do you have a favorite or recommend?
Yeah, we used two of them. I really hesitate to suggest using propane too much because it's dangerous. Um, we actually use it very little on client properties. Occasionally, I'll use it for burning out like a gravel patio area or something. Um, but really the weather has to be the right conditions. I use it mostly on our project, and we haven't started using that as an installation method yet. But I like, for larger spaces, using a long propane torch that has a hose connected to a large, I think, what is it, 20-pound tank. Um, you can get those at any hardware store. That works really well. I also have a little cane torch that connects to a small, like 2-pound camping propane tank and gives a flame like this. And that works really well for burning around like edges and corners and along the side of the house. And I do that a lot in areas. We have a couple gravel, like limestone patio areas in our yard, that would take forever to weed and about 2 minutes to just singe the leaves real quick. No herbicides, also not much for insect life or wildlife in those areas, so I can feel comfortable using it pretty freely.
Very neat. And then some of the grasses that you're trimming, do you use a mower on those or a hand tool?
For the grasses
Oh, I
in
think
the garden.
lawn grasses, I'm
Oh, in the
suspecting.
long grass, we always have our clients, prior to an installation, mow those garden areas as short as they can for a couple weeks. We also ask them to bag those clippings if they can, especially if the grass is growing really long. I know a lot of times we end up in yards where it's like, 4-inch foxtails, especially late summer going into fall installations. So we just try to do that to get the seeds out of the soil. I'm sure there are probably still many, many more times of the seed in the soil already, but it just can help us a little bit. Also, the short sod, for a couple weeks. I've heard Organic Bob explain this to me once, or in a presentation one time, that lawn turf, the root system will generally over time reflect the length of the blade of the grass. So if you can mow that grass down to a shorter length for a couple weeks, ideally that root system is also following suit, making it easier to cut out.
Absolutely. Lovely. And then do you find yourself working a lot with shade or sunny places or
Yeah, we just kind of had this realization not too long ago. A lot of our projects are on hills, big slopes, areas that people don't want to mow. They can't really do anything else there. I think they're always great candidates for natural areas, because, if it's not functional any other way, why not revert it back to a natural space? You also get some interesting I'm not sure ecotones if the is the phrase, but you can get some different diversity as opposed to a big flat area. With a hill, you're going to have areas where water's channeling, you're going to have dry spots, you're going to have those low areas. So you can have a cool opportunity for species diversity on slopes. We also do a lot of, we do end up working in very deep shade areas, um,
Okay.
because people have a hard time growing stuff in those areas. Now, we generally end up putting more perennial plants in those areas, since the seed establishment is always going to take multiple years before you really start seeing things go. What is it? Wood anemone can take 7 years to bloom once, and it's a beautiful plant, but a lot of those plants will take a little longer to establish. So we'll try to get a little jump start with plugs or small plants, which can increase the cost and, of course, the ecological footprint of the project. But we also suggest too is trying to let more light in. So in those deep shade areas, thinking about tree shrub removal, removing lower branches. Again, in an environment, in a historical environment with woodland caribou and elk and bison and wildfires, a lot of those lower branches wouldn't be there anyways. A lot of those dense thickets of trees wouldn't be there, likely be there anyways. So you can, I think a lot of times people can get stuck in that headspace, like the more plants, the better. But including myself a few years ago, and thinking more about how we can create a productive and diverse space. You can still have a shady woodland garden, but it's amazing what just one low hanging branch will do to the amount of light that gets into a space. So always think about that.
Neat. And then do you use some compost as fertilizer? I think I'm answering the question right. Do you use compost in your designs?
No compost, no fertilizer, no soil amendments at all. We work with what we have. Um, I find that, especially in those berms, those recycled berms where we put the sod, you'll see a lot of growth. There'll be a lot of extra nitrogen in that soil. Now, I've heard different numbers about nitrogen, but according to one source that I really trust, we likely have 10 times the amount of nitrogen in our soils as we did 100 years ago. Most, if not all, of the weeds or really aggressive plants that we deal with in our landscapes, whether it's buckthorn or garlic mustard, are considered nitrophiles. They're nitrophilic plants, so they thrive in nitrogen-rich soils. So our native plants actually do well in what we would consider poor soil in a conventional gardening world, or in the agriculture world. And I like to embrace that. We've had really good results, and we can see that in action where we have taken all the topsoil off of an area and flipped it onto a berm that's covering sod. In a first year, we might have plants that only reach 3 to 4 inches tall in that area that is completely stripped of topsoil and down to more of a native soil. And we'll have 6 foot tall plants growing out of the berm just a few feet away. Now, the berms are also full of non-native weeds in addition to these really aggressive plants. And the native plants that we do have in that area are going to be dominant ones: goldenrods, black-eyed Susans. The low garden areas in that first year that are taking their sweet time to establish, there are hardly any weeds, hardly any flowers that first year too, unfortunately, but there are hardly any weeds. And the diversity is always much more in those areas. We're seeing a lot more little tiny rattlesnake masters popping up. We're seeing little lead plants popping up, things that wouldn't have a chance in the thick jungle of a fast growing area of that garden. So to be quite honest, we haven't been doing this long enough to really see that to its full potential. That'll be many years down the road, if we are lucky to really have it mastered by the end of our lives even. But to get back to your question, we don't use any soil amendments. The way we see it, even if we can get 4 or 5 inches of compost down, we might see a really great flush of growth, but those roots are going to be in native soil eventually. And how have they adapted to those growing conditions?
I love it. We had a speaker reminding us that the native uh, base soil, not the humus layer, not the dirt that we think of, but that, it's so important. Like it's sort of like the coevolution of flowers and plants, with the plants and the soil and that thoughtfulness.
I love that. I love that.
Um, Got a few more questions. Cutting grass, quack or crab, doesn't this encourage the plants to grow more vigorously and then spread through the roots?
Can it can. It can also give it opportunities for potentially more dominant native plants. Quackgrass is tricky. You could try to start over. Chances of getting all of it are pretty slim. Crabgrass, at least the variety I'm familiar with, is an annual grass that needs to reproduce by seed in disturbed soil every year. So I find that although we do work on crabgrass, especially the thick stuff, as long as the soil is staying undisturbed, which means, no raking, no pulling or transplanting new plants, that is pretty much gone by the next year in most of our gardens. Um, Especially if you can give the opportunity for some of those natives to grow through it that first year, since it is a warm season grass. If you can just get some early season plant growth that is just enough to cover the soil, it's not going to have enough sunlight to even really grow that second year if it is growing there. It likes poor soil with full sun. So quackgrass is something that we're working on in a couple projects. We mow it a couple times, and by mow I mean hand shears, selectively grabbing clumps of the crabgrass. We mow it low, really trying to be delicate for other grasses that might be growing through it. We find that Sidotes grama really tends to like to grow within crabgrass a lot of times and can be good competition. We'll learn more about that next year on a couple projects. But yeah, it will encourage it to grow more and probably spread. But if we have a lot of aggressive natives in that area, the idea is that they can outcompete. And you might have to live with crabgrass being a presence in that area unless you do a complete excavation. But again, we're going to that balance. Is it ever going to be perfect? Probably not. Can you create a really productive, really beneficial wild space with quackgrass in it while it's being managed? Yeah, and just you've got to figure out what that means.
You know how I interpret all of that? It says, if you're not having fun, then don't do that.
Yeah.
Like that's what it sounds like a lot of the stuff is kind of keep having fun, like instead
Yeah.
of the wait a couple of years for it all to be a blank slate. I kind of like that. Thrift store.
Yeah, and you get those years too, for wildlife. And even the most sterile lawn environment likely has generations and generations of insects and birds and all sorts of animals that have been in that space. And wiping that clean, you could be ending bloodlines. So I like to think about it as a gradual transition over into natural space that'll take time. And it's not just going to be this like boom prairie. I mean, really, the idea of creating a prairie is not realistic, since a prairie is thousands of years old, and we can't just recreate that prairie in a matter of a couple years. We can emulate a prairie. We can do our best to get there close, but there's like I've heard someone say it's just like a rainforest. Um, you can't just plant the rainforest real quick. The rainforest is a culmination of many, many years, hundreds, if not thousands of years of plant life growing. And we have to think about prairies that same way, which is why it's even more important to get started now and start doing this work, because we have less than 1% of those prairies left and less than 1% of our oak savanna left as well. So.
Yes, improvements. So somebody's nervous about damaging their tree roots when using their sod remover. Do you have any tips about helping the tree not get suffered from that?
Yeah, I like to use a shovel around tree roots. Um, um, for one, I like to use a short, flat, square transfer shovel to do sod removal. If you follow us on our Instagram, we have some stories showing how I use that. The tree species can be important too. Um, there are certain trees that I could really care less if I'm cutting some roots. And then there are certain trees that I want to be really careful of. Um, and that really kind of comes down to, sensitivity. Birches have pretty sensitive root systems, and also age and importance. So if it's a big, beautiful bur oak that might be 300 years that we're working around, I'll be out there with a toothpick, even though it's probably a pretty tough one to handle it. I just don't want to take the chance. If it's, a young ash tree or an aspen or an old ash tree that's already on its way out, then I'll do what it takes to get the gardens looking good.
Well, if you like puns, it sounds like triage. Have you encountered
Oh,
jumping worms in your work?
no, I have not yet. I've been not yet. I have not come across jumping worms, nor have I seen the signs of jumping worms yet in any of our projects. So fingers crossed, knock on
Yeah.
wood, I don't see that anytime soon. But yeah, when I do, and I've been doing a little research, but I'll probably have to have some sort of game plan for that, and it'll be an experiment for the books when we do have that. So.
How much do you do to control more aggressive natives, not weeds, and can you introduce other species among other mature hardy natives?
Yeah. So one thing that we really didn't talk about much is our edits of our natural area edits, our management, where we'll go into spaces that aren't sod, aren't just lawn, um, and are typically full of plants like buckthorn, garlic mustard, burdock, motherwort. Natives like stinging nettle, Canada goldenrod, and we'll work with that material. And rather than going in and excavating the whole area, we realize that there are that the soil structure, whether it's the fungal health of that soil and the age of that soil, is a valuable head start for us. So we'll overseed in those areas, and we'll work over a couple of years on removing those plants. A lot of cutting, a lot of pulling too. So for plants like motherwort, we'll generally let that grow through the summer. As it's flowering and starting to set seed, we'll cut it down to about 2 feet, maybe taller, maybe shorter, depending on the environment. And then we'll come through later that summer. Usually, if it's flowering and about to set seed, it usually will not have enough energy to flower and seed anymore that year. And then we just go through when it comes time to doing that fall seeding and pull on those little handles and rip the root systems out of the ground, disturbing the soil and then getting fresh seed in those soil areas. Plants like burdock, we basically have a 2-year plan for. If there's just a few plants, we'll go through and spike the roots and pull those plants. But we will generally wait for them to go into their flowering phase and cut them. And that's usually enough. Towards the end of the summer, that's usually enough to just knock them out. For the aggressive natives, which I realized the question was about, different strategies for different plants. We just did some experimenting with Canada goldenrod this year, which we had seeded very heavily in our gardens our first year, not, totally understanding what we were doing. I also seeded a bunch of burdock in our gardens because the seed was everywhere. And I was like, okay, yeah, I can do that. Burdock, we saw like maybe a dozen plants. It really never took off. But Canada goldenrod did pretty well. Did pretty well in a couple different areas. One area in particular, it kind of spread. So this year, it's been spreading for a couple years. So this year we decided to go really heavy on it. It was a late June cutback, cutting it down to the ground in late June. And it eventually made it to about a foot tall in those areas. But what's within there is a lot of echinacea, a lot of monarda, golden alexander. So we're really starting to see that come through. I have seen a study, believe it's the University of Nebraska, where doing late summer mowbacks on goldenrod will increase the amount of goldenrod weevils the following year that can help control plants. So um, there are different things. So far there has not been a native plant that has been more than I can deal with. Even the most aggressive native and non-native plants with just a little persistence have been pretty easy to keep under control. So
Yay. Okay, so I had the grass question wrong. It was about long-term management rather than installing for regarding their mowing regime.
Yeah. Well, so for long-term management, I think it really depends on the size. Now, all of our projects are residential spaces, so we're probably not ever going to be doing big mows, big seasonal mowing, where we're taking everything down to a certain height. And we're probably never going to be able to do prescribed burns because of the logistics of that.
I wondered about that in the cityscape kind of urban
Yeah.
management.
So, right now, like all of our gardens are just a few years old. So we are taking that brown plant material in late spring once the bugs start moving around, and we're kind of working that back in on the top of the soil in areas that are thin and moving it from thick areas to other areas. By the end of the summer, we're pretty much down to bare soil again, so we're still not seeing that accumulation of like burnable material that really needs that burn. Um, so yeah, time will tell. We're going to do our best to emulate fires in the future. When we start seeing that accumulation of dead material, we'll just have to haul it out as opposed to burn it up. We've had thoughts about like setting up a little fire pit and burning it, and then taking all the ash and spreading it back over the gardens. We'll have to get creative, but for right now, we're not seeing any negative impacts of no burn or of no mow. What we do instead of the mow is selective mowing. So mowing is really trying to emulate grazing mammals, large grazing mammals. So what we'll do is we'll go through and we'll be selective about the plants that we want to cut down. A lot of times that coincides in the spring with early spring flowers blooming. So rather than mowing all of those down, we can go through and start cutting back some of those, giant 12-foot tall sawtooth sunflowers that we'll see in the August, and cutting them back to the ground in June and have something more manageable, a little later blooming 6-foot tall sawtooth sunflower. We're learning the rhythms of each individual plant, how it reacts to different pruning at different timing in our yard. And we're also learning and realizing that same species will act different in a different yard. So there's a lot to digest there.
Neat. Does this annual biennial management include mowing of the native plants to remove excess plant material? Oh, I think you just covered that.
Yeah, it's kind of what I was saying there towards the end there. Yeah, so rather than mowing, we're able to go through selectively and really be careful. And that's where the gardening element comes in, and that's where we're more gardening than restoration, where you'd see that practice more often. So
Very fun. Any use of corn gluten to discourage seeds?
no, I haven't. I've heard about it. I know nothing about it. I'd like to learn more. I'm going to make a note to learn more about corn gluten right now.
And then it looks like the last question we've got is, have you encountered situations with infected trees, spruces with terminal fungus, for example, in your seeding areas? And if so, how do you manage that? Do you leave that for an arborist to handle?
Yeah, I do. I know a little bit about tree diseases, but really, when working with our customers, I always like to defer to a professional certified arborist who will really be able to take the lead on that. We do see spruces in our urban spaces kind of struggling. You see that a lot. I think there's a lot of good info out there. To either research yourself or to reach out to an arborist to have some help. But that's something that we don't deal with, and I don't know a whole lot about.
Well, Karl, this has just been a delightful presentation, and
That's
sounds
good.
like you have a lot of fun doing what you do.
Love it. Yeah, we love it. It's been amazing. It's just I can't really imagine a better job for me and for us. It's been great.
Yay. Well, congratulations, and thank you again so very much. I don't know if anybody else wants to say thank you, and we're very appreciative of your time this evening.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you everyone for following along with my presentation today. Like I said before, I would love it if you reached out and we can keep the conversation going.
Yeah.
Say thank you too. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.